After playing the recent demo and following the whole soap opera that was this title's development, I feel like we need to align our expectations on what Saber Interactive is about to deliver. For those who don't remember or haven't followed the news, this game's development context was a true roller coaster of emotions and a lot of silence. We had that exciting initial announcement, but then spent months in pure agony with no news, especially during that tense period when Saber Interactive was splitting from the Embracer Group. I confess that as a big fan of cooperative games and the master of horror, John Carpenter, I was terrified the project had been canceled and tossed into the back drawer for good. Fortunately, relief came when the developer's leadership went public to confirm the game was still alive, sharing the studio's attention with giants like Space Marine 2. Our reward for that anxious wait was that incredible trailer at the Game Awards late last year, locking in the exact release date. Seeing that they not only survived the company restructuring, but also managed to keep the bloody, over-the-top essence of 80s action and horror intact was a huge victory for those of us who loved this style. The story is exactly the kind of narrative I like to see in cooperative games. Simple in structure, but full of personality and room for bone-crushing chaos between friends. The premise is quite clear. In the near future, humanity tries to harness energy directly from the Earth's core, and as always happens in 80s horror movies, ends up releasing an ancient mud god called the Sludge God, which transforms the planet into a tangle of rotten earth and infected people. The plot doesn't try to hide behind heavy metaphors. It screams right in your face that we're dealing with a sludge zombie apocalypse caused by human arrogance. What I found most interesting, playing the demo and watching the trailers, is that the story doesn't strive to be deep as much as it tries to create the perfect setting for the player to feel like part of a B-movie. We see scientists scared out of their wits, corporate snakes, and in the middle of it all, a team of totally unprepared mercenaries with no morals and only interested in money, which is the core of the Toxic Commandos. Instead of grand heroes, the narrative delivers a group of scoundrels who have no choice but to face the chaos because someone decided to pay the bare minimum to save the world. This choice reminds me a lot of those classics where the band of protagonists is clearly out of place, and that's an incredible narrative hook. One thing that caught my attention, especially from the demo and what the developers themselves mention in interviews, is the story's tone of comedic self-awareness. The characters comment on the absurd situations, complain that their boss is an asshole, that the contract sucks, and that they are definitely not the best team the world could have to stop a mud god. This ensures that even in the midst of a horror setting, we don't feel immersed in a heavy drama, but in a trashy action movie with zombies ruining everything, which fits like a glove for a game focused on hordes and cooperative chaos. Another strong point, in my view, is how the story serves the gameplay and not the other way around. We get short missions with clear objectives, possible failures, and a loop of exploring open areas, returning to base, reinforcing vehicles, and diving back into the mud. This creates an act from a B-movie narrative flow, where each cycle is a chapter of more destruction, but always with the same goal: slowing down the sludge god's advance and saving what can still be saved. It feels less like playing an RPG with lots of lore, and more like starring in a sludge zombie blockbuster with the reset button working perfectly. Anyone who played the demo notices that the story successfully delivers the feeling of an unlikely team. The characters don't know each other well, have thin backstories, and often it seems the game doesn't even want to go too deep into that. This might be a weak point for those seeking charismatic protagonists, but for a game centered on action, hordes, and vehicles, this lightness works very well. Identity comes more from what we do together as a team than any deep background, which leaves the plot more as a backdrop for the chaos than the main focus. I also think it's worth mentioning that John Carpenter's presence, even if more indirect, gives the universe a very striking personality. The inspiration comes precisely from that atmosphere of something you can't understand but need to destroy that he explored so much in films like The Thing. The sludge god carries a vibe of an ancient, cheesy entity that isn't just zombie number 2, it's a ridiculous and disgusting cosmic force, which gives a special flavor to the conflict. It may not be as complex as some modern horror scripts, but it works perfectly for the type of game the developers want to make. An everything in one explosion experience with lots of laughs and blood. John Carpenter's Toxic Commando story is exactly what I expected from a game like this. Direct, dirty, fun, and aware of its own absurdity. It doesn't intend to win a screenwriting award, but it fulfills the role of keeping players inside a funny, violent world full of gross creatures to blow up in a group. For those who enjoy playing with friends, messing around, seeing the scenery fall apart, and laughing at their own situation, this narrative is more than enough. It's the perfect foundation for the chaos we'll want to repeat over and over again. The gameplay after playing the demo gave me a very clear feeling. It's a horde shooter made to be messy, loud, and cooperative, with its own identity thanks to the vehicles and the muddy terrain. The central idea the team released sums up what you feel at the controls. World War Z meets Mud Runner. Huge swarms plus navigation as an essential part of the loop. If you go in expecting a super cinematic and linear campaign, you'll find it strange. But if you go in wanting team chaos with objectives and an extraction route, it clicks fast. The shooting itself is satisfying and direct, the kind that works because the game gives you many targets and rewards you for controlling panic. In the demo, the impact of weapons against the hordes is very satisfying, especially when the game starts throwing more enemies on the screen, and you realize that the priority becomes positioning and rhythm, not perfect aiming all the time. And the coolest part, the feeling of we're losing, now we've turned the tide, happens frequently when the team manages to regroup, revive someone, and pull off a well-made defense. The big differentiator for me is the vehicles, because here they aren't just transport, they are a tool for combat and survival. The demo and previews show and discuss things like winches to get out of the mud, breaking obstacles, and even interacting with the environment. And this completely changes how you read the map. Additionally, some vehicles have their own abilities, like EMP pulses and flamethrowers, so you start thinking about the car's build and function the same way you think about your weapon. That's where the game moves away from that standard Left 4 Dead with a different skin package, because the car becomes part of your kit. The design of the semi-open areas and the loop of loot, complete objective, hold horde, extract also became very evident in the demo. You're not just walking forward. There are points of interest, loot, and resources that seem to feed progression and prepare the team for the next fight. This format works very well for co-op because there's always someone in the group with a micro-task, gathering resources, marking items, holding an entrance, fixing something, without it becoming that mess where everyone just runs and dies. Regarding classes and progression, what has been shown so far suggests they want a middle ground between easy to get into and has depth for those who stay. Some are saying the skill trees are deeper than they look and allow for adjusting playstyles, and I felt that a bit in the demo by how skills change each character's role in combat. In a co-op game, this is gold, because it prevents everyone from just being the shotgun guy and gives a real reason to coordinate compositions. Now, the part I'm watching with caution, repetition, and polish. The base is fun, but since the loop is very clear, open zone, objectives, horde, vehicle, extract, the game will need real variety in missions, events, and special enemies to avoid becoming a predictable grind after a few nights. And since it's a game that demands 4-person chaos, any friction, confusing interface, weak bots, lack of signaling, can weigh more heavily than in a single-player shooter. Overall, Overall, my opinion after the demo is that Toxic Commando has everything to be that perfect Friday night game when you want to call friends and laugh at the disaster while trying to survive. It embraces exaggeration, builds combat around giant hordes, and still has this different seasoning of vehicles and mud that really alters the way you play. If they get the balance between content variety and progression right without it turning into a chore after a few nights, it could be one of the most enjoyable co-ops of the year for those who like no-nonsense PvE action.
The graphics, from what I felt playing the demo, aren't that next-gen leap that will become a technical benchmark, but they are very competent at what the game actually needs: legibility in the chaos, a B-movie atmosphere, and decent performance even with a horde filling the screen. The impression I got was pretty enough to sell the filth, with light, particles, and gore working in favor of the spectacle without trying to look like a realistic simulator. This fits perfectly with the over-the-top proposal and the 80s vibe that the game's marketing keeps reinforcing. The first visual merit here is the art direction and palette. Everything looks intentionally dirty, damp, and contaminated. The mud and sludge have a presence, and the game uses this look to remind you all the time that the world is rotting from the inside out, not just that there are zombies on the street. In several scenes of the demo, I had that feeling of a wet and dense setting, with lighting helping to provide contrast between enemies, the environment, and effects, which is essential when the horde starts covering your crosshairs. When the subject turns to the horde, that's where I think the graphics shine more as a result of the whole because of one specific detail. The density of enemies on screen is part of the visual impact, because it's not just more models, it's the sense of volume and pressure coming your way. And even without being the most detailed game in the world in every individual texture, the overall result conveys that cheap blockbuster energy. A lot happening at once, with explosions, exaggerated blood, and a clear reading of threats. For a co-op shooter, I honestly prefer this over ultra-realism that turns into visual noise. The characters and enemies for me are in a middle ground. Functional, expressive enough, but not where the game wants to impress you. The cool thing is that the exaggeration of blood, slime, and exploding bodies helps create a unique identity, and this appears a lot in the first impressions of those who tested it too. I like it when a game understands that finish is also consistency of style, and Toxic Commando seems very aware of the kind of trashy fun it wants to be. And there's a detail I really liked seeing in the released material, and while playing. The visuals talk to the vehicle system. When you're driving and crossing mud, the game needs to sell friction, dirt, and weight, and I thought it managed to convey that impression without feeling stuck or like a separate minigame. The promise and official communication of the project always hit on this mix of shooting and vehicles, and visually, you can notice that the terrain and the grossness of the world were thought out for this, not just tossed on top. Speaking of performance and presentation quality, I saw two very positive signs in the demo. First, people are reporting very high performance on PC with DLSS on and still praising the overall visual fidelity, which matches the feeling that the game is well optimized for the amount of enemies it puts on screen. Second, there's also an impression that it doesn't push boundaries, but holds up well in lighting, effects, and enough detail so you don't feel like you're playing something cheap. For a co-op game, stability is worth gold, because any small stutter in a horde becomes a team wipe. My only fear, and this is very personal, is the game relying too much on effects and density to look better than it actually is, and ending up visually repetitive if the biomes don't vary much. If the sludge dominates everything the same way in too many maps, identity can turn into monotony. But if they use this solid base, good lighting, cool effects, convincing dirt, and firm performance to vary environments, colors, and enemy silhouettes, I think the visuals will age well, because it's not trying to be the most realistic, but the most stylish within its premise. Imagine the scene. You're in the middle of a muddy road. The horde starts to thicken out of nowhere. Explosions everywhere. Cars skidding. And what decides if the mission becomes a beautiful clip or a total disaster isn't your aim. It's the game holding the performance without betraying you. This was the first impression the demo left me. When it's running well, it's delicious because the chaos becomes part of the spectacle, not a technical problem. What surprised me positively is that even being a game that bets on a lot happening at once, several impressions indicate that the demo remained reasonably stable even with a lot of horde on the screen. This matches my practical feeling that the game seems to prioritize consistency in combat, because here, any micro stutter at the wrong time becomes a team wipe. For a co-op shooter, this is worth more than ultra-realistic graphics. On PC, the most encouraging sign I saw in reports is that some people are getting very high FPS numbers with strong hardware and DLSS, like keeping well above 100 FPS in common settings for 1440p. This gives me the impression that an optimization base exists, and that the game isn't trying to be a benchmark in disguise. And honestly, for a horde game, I prefer exactly this philosophy. Another thing I consider performance in practice is the fluidity of reading the game. It needs to respond fast, the camera needs to help you, and the interface must not get in the way. Here comes a point I find quite serious. In early impressions of the demo, the absence of an FOV slider was pointed out, and this can affect comfort and sense of control even when the FPS is good. In first person, especially in tight situations and hordes, FOV is not a luxury, it's accessibility and clarity. And then comes the layer that almost no one remembers when saying performance, but that defines a co-op. Network, and online stability. In community discussions, you can see people commenting on connection reliability and fixes, but also making it clear that there's still a feeling of rough edges to be sanded down. I don't treat this as a final verdict, because a demo is a demo, but co-op without stability becomes frustration fast. What I think works in Toxic Commando's favor is that it seems to be aiming for consistent frame time instead of just chasing peak FPS. This choice fits the proposal of adding enemy density and keeping a fast pace. You don't want 140 FPS in an empty area and 45 FPS when everything gets fun. You want a stable line when the game demands reflexes. If the final version maintains this, it will be a great differentiator. The demo gave me confidence in the performance foundation, especially on PC with well-configured upscaling, but it still left me demanding about comfort and co-op stability, because that's where this kind of game lives or dies. If they get these details right, Toxic Commando has everything to be that game you call your friends for without fear of it becoming a night of adjustments and crashes, but rather a night of fun chaos. If you're short on cash and want certainty, I'd say wait a few weeks. If you want a horde co-op to play with friends on day one, the demo left me very inclined to buy it at launch. The game arrives on March 12th, 2026, PS5, Xbox Series, and PC. And from what the demo showed, it already has a fun foundation of shooting, hordes, and semi-open map missions that works very well when you get into the mood. But it's exactly the kind of game where the launch state, bugs, balancing, matchmaking, defines whether you're going to love it or get angry. For me, the main argument for buying at launch is simple. The loop is addictive and the tone is enjoyable. I liked the 80s B-movie take with gore and exaggeration, and I felt that the first-person horde combat has that Saber knows how to do swarms impact. It also helps that the demo gave a relatively stable impression of performance, which is a good omen for a game that lives on putting a lot on the screen. Now, my number one reason to wait is that the demo also showed there are still rough edges that could turn into daily irritation, especially if you play alone or with randoms. In early impressions, for example, there is direct criticism regarding the absence of an FOV slider, something that affects comfort and can ruin long sessions for many people. And in co-op games, any friction, interface, bots, connection, options, weighs more than in single player because a small problem becomes a repeated problem every match. The game is recommended for those who enjoy cooperative PvE hordes, missions with objectives, and that feeling of everything is on fire, but we can save it if the team doesn't tilt. The official material and game pages hit hard on a squad of up to 4 players with focus on co-op and chaos, and that's clearly where it shines. If you like Left 4 Dead, World War Z, and the Light, especially for the vibe and rhythm, the chance of you enjoying this is high. In my humble opinion, I wouldn't recommend it for those who want a strong, super polished narrative experience, or for those who have no one to play with. The gameplay overview itself emphasizes that it was built for 4 players of chaos and suggests that playing solo leaves you more vulnerable and can overwhelm you quickly. You can play alone, but the game's fantasy is the squad, and the demo seemed much more fun when you imagine the communication and the mess with friends. Regarding, is it more worth buying now or later? I would set a practical rule. Buying at launch is worth it if you have a group or really enjoy matchmaking and want to participate from the beginning, because this type of game is more alive when everyone is learning together. It also counts that the publisher is already talking about free post-launch updates with new missions, enemies, weapons, and vehicles, so you can imagine the game will grow over time. If you prefer to get a more rounded game with more accumulated content, waiting tends to be the more rational choice. I'll probably buy it at launch if I have at least 2 more people to play with me on day 1, because the flavor of the cooperative chaos and the semi-open missions hooked me. If I realize I'm mostly going to end up with randoms and the game comes out with comfort issues like FOV and adjustments, I'll wait for 1 or 2 updates and then dive in.
Don't stop. Keep it up. The EMP's been sludged. Damage it in this state. It has to be awakened. How much of a fight?
You need to activate the